The Bitterroot Mountains held their breath that morning. As dawn filtered through the mist clinging low across the ridgeline, the wilderness stood still beneath the weight of something unspoken. The wind had not yet stirred. No hooves thudded across the rocks. Even the birds remained hushed, as if nature itself understood that something ancient, something primal, was about to surface from the belly of the earth. Dr. Claire Bennett exhaled slowly through her scarf, the cold biting her skin as she crouched on the frost-slicked ledge above Silver Creek Basin. Her camera lens had fogged once, twice, before she wiped it with the hem of her thermal sleeve. She had been watching Sierra for weeks now. The mare's belly had dropped, the signs of foaling unmistakable, but even with 15 years of experience photographing wild herds, Claire had never seen a birth out here. Not in the wild, not this far from roads, fences, and interference. Below her, Sierra circled in the dew-soaked grass, her powerful frame taut with effort. The other mares in the herd had instinctively stepped back, forming a wide crescent around her as she labored alone beneath the pale lavender sky. The air carried no sound but the soft rhythmic grunts of strain and the occasional snort from nearby stallions standing sentinel among the trees. And then it happened. Claire's fingers locked on her camera trigger as Sierra dropped to her knees with a low, guttural whinny. The silhouette of a foal slid free in a glistening heap onto the grass, limbs gangly and slick with afterbirth. Claire adjusted her focus, waiting to catch the first twitch of movement, the first breath, but as the newborn began to rise, its body steaming in the morning chill, something inside her chest went still. She lowered the camera. The foal's coat shimmered gold-white in the new light, not the soft beige of a palomino, not the dusty gray of a typical desert-born Mustang. This was something else entirely. The body, creamy and smooth like polished bone, bore intricate golden markings that seemed too precise to be random, forming symmetrical arcs across his flank and shoulders like the echo of flames. His mane, though wet and clumped, gleamed silver at the roots with flickers of gold through the strands. And those eyes, wide, bright, pale blue like winter sky, seemed to shift subtly as he blinked into the light, as though responding not just to the world but to her gaze from the cliffs above. Claire didn't speak. She couldn't. She simply stared, the camera now forgotten in her hands. No wild foal looked like that. Not in Montana. Not anywhere. She fumbled for the recorder at her side, whispered into it with a voice that trembled despite the stillness of her hands. "I'm witnessing an anomaly, a Cremello foal with full-body symmetry and coat patterning, unrecorded behavior from a confirmed Spanish Barb mare, genetic probability. Statistically impossible." Sierra nuzzled the foal with forceful affection, urging him to his feet. He wobbled, slid, braced, and stood high-legged and unsure, but already showing a grace in his movement that seemed unnatural for an animal only minutes old. One of the younger stallions took a step closer, but Sierra pinned her ears and lunged sideways, a low squeal escaping her throat. She would allow no one near. Claire watched through the scope as the rest of the herd remained eerily still. No nickers, no greeting. Only observation, as if they too understood they had just witnessed the birth of something more than one of their own. The foal, already steadying, lifted his head and looked toward Claire's ledge. She froze. There was no way he could see her. Not from that distance, not with the wind in her favor, but the moment held nonetheless. Long, unbroken, measured. He blinked, tilted his head, then turned back toward Sierra's flank. Claire, heart pounding, leaned back against the rock wall and let her eyes close for a beat. When she opened them again, she lifted her camera and took the first real photo. Not the moment of birth, not the markings, just the space between them. The moment something ancient had entered the world again. By noon, she had hiked back to her mobile camp and uploaded the footage. Hair samples from the birth site had been placed in sterile containers. She prepped the samples, scanned the footage, emailed the compressed files to one person only, Dr. Malcolm Ross at UC Boulder, her mentor and the only scientist she trusted to analyze the genetic implications without leaking the discovery. But secrets never stayed secrets long. Within 36 hours, Malcolm replied with a message more urgent than she'd anticipated. "Claire," the email read, "preliminary analysis confirms heterozygous markers for both cream dilution and dominant white. Combined lineage includes trace markers from Iberian and Arabian strains long presumed extinct. We may be looking at a spontaneous reactivation of dormant bloodlines." Her heart thudded against her ribs as she reread the last line. "Claire, this foal shouldn't exist." By the end of the week, strangers began appearing. Hikers who weren't hikers, drone operators flying without permits, a van parked off a logging road with no plates and too many antennae, one man with binoculars dressed in REI gear but wearing military-issue boots. The air around Silver Creek started to change, not in temperature but in tone. Watchful, tense, hunted. Claire reported the activity to the Bureau of Land Management, but protocol was slow and the herd was isolated. Only one ranger patrolled the Bitterroot boundary, Isaac Cole, ex-Army-turned-wildlife officer with a quiet demeanor and eyes that didn't miss much. He'd worked with Claire before, once saving her from a flash flood in the Southern Valley when she'd hiked too deep during a storm system. She trusted him. He arrived at her camp 3 days later, shotgun slung behind his back, eyes scanning the ridge before he even stepped into view. "I don't like the feel of this," he said, voice low. "Had to chase 2 guys out near the South Ridge, night vision goggles. Claimed they were birdwatchers." Claire showed him the photos, the samples, the footage. Isaac watched in silence, jaw tightening as Phoenix Claire had named him that now strutted across the valley floor in the clip, markings gleaming under mid-morning sun. "Jesus," he muttered. "He's not just rare, he's dangerous." Claire stiffened. "To the wrong people," Isaac clarified. "He's worth more than gold if he's real, and I think some of those people already know it." The next morning, Claire returned to her post, but the herd had moved deeper into the valley. It was Sierra's pattern to remain near water for foaling recovery, but now she had taken Phoenix into the forest canyons, territory they hadn't occupied in months. Claire scanned the distant trees through her lens, but a flicker of movement on the cliffside caught her attention. A drone. Small, silent, camouflaged, tracking. By the time she reached Isaac's radio signal, the drone was gone, and so was any illusion of control. What had started as a miracle had already become a threat. The winter light filtered differently through the Bitterroot pines after Phoenix's birth. What once felt sacred now trembled with something more fragile uncertainty. Claire had seen anomalies in the field before, odd mutations, mismatched coat colors, even inter-herd adoptions, but none of them had challenged the core of what she thought she knew about wild horse genetics. Phoenix wasn't a fluke. He was a fracture in the known world. The samples she'd sent to Malcolm came back with metadata flagged in red. The DNA sequences showed lineages that weren't just unusual, they were unheard of in this region. Spanish barb, yes. That was expected in trace form. But embedded deep in the analysis were markers linked to old European warmbloods, breeds long presumed extinct in free-roaming populations. One strand matched an 18th-century Andalusian line Claire had only read about in historical registries. Another, a sliver pointed toward ancient Arabian strains not documented in this hemisphere for over 2 centuries. It was impossible. And yet, the data stared back like a whisper from something buried alive. Claire spread the reports across the makeshift desk in her trailer, tracing the highlighted bands with trembling fingers. A printed page fluttered under the heater, vent a scan of Sierra's old BLM file from 2012. The form was blunt. Low genetic value. Recommend sterilization or reallocation. Claire stared at the box checked in ink. Somehow, Sierra had escaped a fate assigned by a clerical misjudgment. Had someone intervened? Or had nature found its way past the stamp of bureaucracy? Outside, the wind stirred harder than before. Isaac had installed 2 new trail cameras the day prior, high in the pine stretch where the herd had recently been sighted. When Claire clicked open the memory card on her laptop, the first dozen images were unremarkable: deer, foxes, Sierra grazing. Then, frame by frame, came the silhouettes. Two figures, both in full tactical clothing, their faces masked. They moved with practiced precision, one carrying a black case long enough for a tranquilizer rifle. The timestamps placed them in the herd's zone between midnight and 2 a.m. The fact that they had found the Silver Creek herd in pitch-black darkness without triggering other wildlife or leaving heavy trace meant one thing. They were professionals, not poachers, not thrill-seekers. Trained extraction teams. Claire clenched her jaw. These weren't just opportunists hoping for a glimpse of the golden foal. They were planning something. She radioed Isaac. No pleasantries. Just, "They're coming sooner than we thought." The next night, Claire didn't sleep. She parked herself beneath a tree overlooking the southern corridor of the valley, night vision lens tucked in beside her thermos. But the forest was silent, even as her heartbeat surged louder than the wind. Around 4:15 a.m., that day the silence fractured. A sharp cry cut through the trees, a mare's scream. Not alarm, grief. She ran. By dawn, Sierra was pacing the clearing near the ravine, breath ragged, foam flecking her lips. Her eyes scanned every corner, frantic. No foal answered. The rest of the herd had clustered tight behind her, their hooves stamping as if to churn up answers from the soil. Claire found the tracks within minutes. Deep tire impressions gouged the soft mud near the water's edge. Boot prints at least 4 separate patterns. Drug cartridges discarded hastily. A strip of cloth with anesthetic residue. No blood, no signs of violence, just the precision of a surgical operation. By the time Isaac arrived, Sierra had gone hoarse from crying. Claire didn't speak. She simply handed him the camera's memory card. Together, they watched the thermal drone footage. Phoenix pulled from his mother under a white tarp, loaded into a crate marked Wildlife Relocation, hauled onto a truck bearing a Colorado license plate registered to a breeding company called Hensley Ridge Equines, LLC. Isaac's knuckles whitened on the rifle slung across his shoulder. He knew the name. Eric Hensley wasn't just a breeder. He was an international trader of exotic animals with a history of laundering rare wildlife through private ranches and shell companies. 2 years prior, he had been investigated for trafficking endangered zebras through South Africa using falsified permits. Charges dropped. Witnesses vanished. Ranches burned down. Now he was back, in Montana, and he had Phoenix. Claire's hands shook as she packed her equipment, but something in her expression had changed. The ache of loss was there, but deeper still. The glint of war. They were no longer chasing a miracle. Now they were chasing a theft. The days after Phoenix's disappearance blurred into a silent storm of motion. Each morning, Claire awoke with the hollow certainty of absence pressing against her lungs. A grief that refused to become memory because the foal wasn't lost. He had been taken. That single truth turned her from witness into weapon. The Bureau of Land Management moved quickly once Isaac filed the official wildlife theft report, but the machinery of federal response lagged behind the urgency of the wilderness. Claire had already submitted footage, GPS tags, DNA logs, and timestamps to a growing folder labeled Phoenix. It wasn't science anymore. It was evidence. And now the case had a name. Special Agent Riley Dane, U.S. Fish and Wildlife FBI Division, arrived in Bitterroot under a storm-gray sky, his demeanor as clipped and focused as his plain black suit. He didn't shake hands. He didn't smile. He simply scanned Claire's evidence board, asked precise questions, and took notes with a left-handed scrawl that looked almost mechanical. He understood the stakes, because Phoenix wasn't just a foal. He was proof-living, breathing proof that the genetic river of North America's wild horses had not gone dry. And if that bloodline had been stolen and sold, there was a network profiting from the extinction of history. Claire wasn't a federal agent. She had no badge, no jurisdiction, and no clearance. But that didn't stop her from digging. from cold-calling regional animal control offices, tracking veterinary supply orders, and using open-source drone footage to triangulate movement around Hensley's known properties. She barely slept, barely ate, and when she did, it was with her laptop open and the field radio buzzing beside her shoulder like a second heartbeat. And then, a whisper, a message from Colorado, from a rural equine clinic 2 counties west of Denver. A woman named Dr. Marla Cheng had received an anonymous voicemail tip directing her to examine a pale foal with behavioral issues allegedly bought from a collector in Texas. The request had been vague, the pay offered in cash, the follow-up evasive. She hadn't taken the job, but she had run the description through online alerts, and Phoenix's image had surfaced everywhere. Claire boarded the next research chopper with a duffel bag full of hair samples and a portable DNA sequencer. Riley met her at the helipad. Neither of them spoke during the flight. The noise inside wasn't from the rotors, it was from the gravity of what they were closing in on. The coordinates pointed to a ranch tucked against the pine-draped hills near Loveland. From the air, it looked unremarkable. Fenced pastures, a barn with a green metal roof, a row of travel trailers, but beneath that quiet surface, hidden beneath company aliases and farm tax exemptions, was what Riley called a hot box, a holding station where trafficked animals were cleaned, disguised, and quietly redistributed through a web of international ports. Claire recognized the patterns instantly. She had seen similar operations when collaborating with anti-poaching rangers in Namibia years ago. Facilities disguised as sanctuaries but running like butchered airports, where rare creatures were tagged, photographed, and erased. Operation Amberlight began without announcement. Federal agents moved in under the cover of dawn. Riley coordinated from a surveillance van while Claire, dressed in plain field gear, waited in a safe zone behind the perimeter. Inside, officers fanned out in teams, securing gates, intercepting communications, and combing the property stall by stall. The call came less than an hour later. One stall, rear of the west barn, locked and flanked by sound-dampening panels. Inside, under low halogen lights and behind reinforced mesh, stood a foal the color of sunfire, his mane dulled with chemical dye, his limbs tense with an unnatural stiffness. Claire was escorted in with gloves and a hooded, clean suit. But the moment she stepped into the airspace of that stall, her breath caught. Phoenix had grown taller, leaner, but there was no mistaking him. Even beneath the fading dye, the symmetry of his golden markings shimmered like echoes of flame under his pale coat. His eyes, still pale, still too human, flashed toward her, wide and uncertain. He didn't come near, he didn't bolt, he just stood. Still, broken. Claire knelt slowly, lowered her voice to a whisper shaped only for him. She said nothing about science, nothing about history or genetics or the crimes he had unknowingly survived. She only said his name. The first time he flinched, the second time he looked up, and the third time he stepped forward. Behind her, a federal agent snapped photographs. Another collected swabs for chain of custody, but Claire saw none of it. She was too busy watching the flicker of something return to Phoenix's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or memory, or maybe just the faintest glimmer of safety. Outside, Riley was already briefing press contacts. Inside, the scope of the network unfurled like a map soaked in gasoline. In crates lined with false documents, agents uncovered the carcasses of rare birds. In sealed pens, they found big cats wearing sedation collars. There were computer drives full of customer lists and digital archives of animal traits, breeding possibilities, shipping schedules. The facility had been exporting genetic anomalies as elite collectibles living trophies for the ultra-wealthy. Phoenix had been marked not as a foal, not as a being, but as inventory. The arrests came swift, 3 on site, 4 more from satellite locations. Eric Hensley was not among them. But evidence in the barn office placed him at the ranch within the last 72 hours, and his private jet had filed a flight plan toward Dubai. Claire didn't ask what would happen next. She only asked if Phoenix could go home. Riley said that depended on whether the herd would still accept him. Claire didn't answer, but deep down she knew. Phoenix wasn't the only one who had changed. So had the world he was born to. They waited for dawn. The air above Loveland settled into a quiet so heavy it felt unnatural, like the world had been drained of all sound. Beneath the low ridge near the holding facility, Claire stood in full tactical gear, heart hammering not from fear, but from the fragile hope that Phoenix was still whole on the other side of that compound wall. Around her, the FBI's interagency task force finished their final checks. No sirens, no shouting. Everything was orchestrated for speed and precision, to get in and out before anyone inside could scatter or retaliate. Operation Amberlight was no longer a sting. It was a rescue. Just before first light, Agent Riley Dane gave the go signal. The strike team moved with swift silence. Night vision goggles flickered green. Radios buzzed in short-coded pulses. Claire remained at the perimeter until the message came through. Barn cleared, targets down, stall located. She didn't wait for protocol. She ran. The west barn door had been breached, hinges splayed, the inner hall still lit by industrial lamps that gave off a sickly blue glow. She stepped over discarded equipment, syringes, vet tools, an overturned clipboard labeled Exotic, Urgent, Airport, Ready. Her boots echoed as she neared the final stall, the one shielded by metal insulation and soundproofing. 2 agents flanked the door. One nodded. Inside, time stopped. Phoenix stood alone in a sterile enclosure the size of a shipping container, walls padded, floor covered in coarse straw. His coat, once radiant, was dull, his mane roughly trimmed and stained with a dark rinse to hide the gold. Chemical dye clung to his flank, dripping where water had partially washed it away. But the markings beneath, those impossible symmetrical shapes, still shimmered faintly under the grime. He didn't look at her. Not yet. He looked past her, as though expecting pain to follow the opening of every door. Claire stepped in slowly, lowering her hood and crouching to his eye level. There were no words, only breath, only a heartbeat she had memorized once from 50 yards away and now felt pounding against her chest. She whispered his name, not as a command, but as a memory. Once. Then again. It wasn't immediate, but something shifted in Phoenix's stance. He blinked, nostrils twitching, ears pivoting toward her voice, and then, with a movement both hesitant and familiar, he took one small step forward. Not to flee, not to challenge. To listen. It was enough. Behind her, the agents moved quietly, setting up a quarantine trailer with heat lamps and fresh hay. Phoenix would be stabilized and medically cleared before transport. They had protocols. Sedation, if necessary. Behavioral restraint, if he panicked. But Claire insisted he not be touched unless absolutely required. Outside, the compound unspooled its horrors. 19 animals, exotic mammals, rare reptiles, and 3 other equines, each tagged for overseas shipment. A wall of forged documents, sedatives, export permits, all bearing seals from countries where trafficking could slip through legal loopholes. The names on the ledger told an uglier truth. Phoenix wasn't an exception. He was part of a menu. Eric Hensley had vanished 2 days earlier, boarding a private jet out of Denver that routed through the Caribbean before dropping off radar. But his operation had left enough digital fingerprints to convict him 10 times over. And one drive, seized from the office safe, contained personal correspondence with high-net-worth clients eager to pay fortunes for genetically unique animals with aesthetic signatures. Phoenix's value had been quantified in digits and decimals. He wasn't rare, he was product. 3 men were arrested on sight, 2 others surrendered within the next week. But Claire didn't ask for their names. What haunted her wasn't who did this, but what it had already done. Phoenix was no longer the foal who had stared back at her through a morning mist with impossible blue eyes. His gaze now held something shuttered. The vibrancy had dimmed. His movements were deliberate, cautious, as though every gesture had been learned through consequence. Claire stayed with him throughout the transport back to Montana. No sedatives were used. She sat beside the crate in the modified livestock trailer, humming softly through the night, not knowing whether it reached him, only that she had to try. When they arrived at the Bitterroot Basin, the valley was already brimming with wind and the scent of pine thawing in the late spring melt. The Silver Creek herd had moved lower in elevation, closer to the warming grasslands, but Sierra had remained near the edge of the river bend, returning daily to the same stretch of forest where she had last seen her son. Claire watched as Phoenix was unloaded slowly from the ramp. He stepped onto the soft earth with hesitation, head low, muscles tensed like coiled springs. Sierra stood at the tree line, motionless. Then, she moved. The moment defied science. It ignored trauma, ignored logic, ignored the statistics of maternal rebonding after forced separation. Sierra stepped forward with cautious purpose, her body quivering, nostrils wide as she caught his scent. She called out, not the high-pitched whinny of alarm, but a low, broken rumble of recognition. Phoenix froze. His ears twitched. His tail flicked. And then one step. Then another. Claire held her breath. Sierra reached him, pressing her muzzle to his shoulder, inhaling deeply. Phoenix didn't recoil. He stood there, rigid at first, and then he leaned in. They stood together like that for a long time. No noise, no motion, just contact. Skin to skin, bone to bone. The connection that time and cruelty had tried to sever was beginning slowly to rethread itself. Claire wiped her face without realizing she'd been crying. The scientists would debate the behavior. The experts would question the bonding metrics. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that a scar was healing in real time, in the open air, beneath the whispering trees that had once welcomed Phoenix into the world. It would take time. It would take patience. But Phoenix had returned. Not whole, not untouched, but alive. By the time summer folded into the golden breath of fall, the story of Phoenix had already seeped into places even the mountains couldn't hold back. Claire stood at the edge of the expanded Silver Creek Preserve. Her boots sunk in soft grass, and her field journal pressed tight to her chest. The air smelled of dried wildflowers and pine sap, the kind of scent that only belonged to places untouched by engines or cities. Somewhere beyond the rise, she could hear hoofbeats. Light, spaced, rhythmic. They weren't urgent, they weren't panicked. They were the sounds of a herd at peace, and Phoenix was among them. He hadn't reintegrated overnight. The first days were delicate. Tentative steps, long pauses, moments when even a snapping twig could send him reeling. The dye eventually washed from his coat, but it took longer for the wariness to fade from his eyes. Sierra had never left his side, her maternal presence a shield that made his healing possible. Other mares had been slower to accept him, and the stallion had initially challenged his return. But over time, Phoenix found his place, not as the prodigy of a lab report, not as the centerpiece of a federal sting, but simply as a young Mustang reclaiming the only world he was born to. Yet he was never ordinary. Even as he grew into his frame, muscle tapering over bone with effortless elegance, his movements retained a kind of precision Claire hadn't seen in any wild horse. He reacted before wind shifted. He stepped deliberately, like memory lived in the dirt beneath his hooves. His golden markings had darkened slightly into a deeper cream, but the symmetry remained, untouched, irreplicable. And his eyes still changed with the light, shifting from pale gray to icy blue, as though his gaze were its own kind of weather. Claire recorded everything, not because she intended to publish it all, but because Phoenix had already become larger than data. His presence was evidence, not of mutation, but of resilience. Within weeks of the raid, the footage of his rescue had gone viral. The images of Phoenix, before and after captivity, spread through scientific circles, conservation networks, then broke loose into mainstream media. News anchors called him the Golden Ghost. Social media dubbed him America's Miracle Mustang. Congress took note, and then came the Phoenix Act. Pushed through the legislative pipeline with bipartisan momentum, the act passed quietly but firmly, enacting enhanced federal protections for genetically unique wildlife. It established emergency response authority for conservation theft, tightened regulation on exotic animal transport, and funneled new funding into wildlife DNA mapping. Phoenix had given Congress something it couldn't ignore: a face, a story, and undeniable proof that nature still held undiscovered strands of history within its blood. Claire never intended to become an advocate, but after testifying before the Senate, she knew her work had only just begun. The Phoenix Institute for Wild Equine Genetics opened the following spring, a modest facility at first, tucked beside the Bitterroot Range with just enough funding to begin mapping wild horse herds across the western states. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't political, it was built with intent, to preserve what had been nearly erased. Malcolm Ross took a visiting chair position, Marla Cheng joined the board. Agent Riley Dane, though technically still with the FBI, became a quiet benefactor, redirecting seized trafficking funds to support the Institute's efforts. Even Isaac, who preferred solitude to spotlight, offered to patrol the expanded borders of the Silver Creek Preserve, ensuring that no one with a drone or a net came close again. But Claire never tried to tag Phoenix. She could have. It would have made her data neater, more traceable. But something in her knew it wasn't her right. Phoenix had already paid more than most creatures ever should for existing. Instead, she learned to follow him by hoofprint and scent, by the way the herd shifted around his position. He became a barometer for change. Wherever he stood, the herd grew calmer, more protective, more cohesive. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a compass. Visitors weren't allowed near the basin. Permits were limited. But every now and then, a school group or research intern would hike the perimeter and catch a glimpse of him in the valley, sunlight dancing across his coat like rippling fire. And always, they fell silent. Because Phoenix didn't just move through the grass. He moved through memory, through the weight of what might have been lost had one birth not been witnessed, had one mother not been spared by a bureaucratic oversight, had one drone not recorded one moment in the frost. 1 year to the day after his rescue, Claire returned alone to the place where it had begun, where she'd first seen Sierra collapse in the dawnlight, where Phoenix had opened his eyes against a world not ready for him. The sun broke over the ridge. Fog lifted from the basin floor, and through the trees, like a whisper drawn forward on hooves, Phoenix appeared. He paused near the clearing, his head lifted high, ears forward. Claire didn't move. She didn't raise her lens. She simply stood, eyes wide, breath still. Phoenix stared for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared back into the brush, into the safety of the wild, into the rhythm of something older than science, older than fences, older than fear. What remained was the silence he left behind. Not empty, sacred.